Testament, as most people call it here, was more of an accuser or a tempter. And I guess it's a bit debatable or whether or not that Satan in the Old Testament could be considered a light bringer or not. It's definitely a trickster type character. So there's some connections there, but I'm not going to answer that part. I'm just going to leave that up to interpretation. But in the New Testament, you have a bit of a different character coming out. Satan itself means adversary. But in the New Testament, he starts to become the epitome of all the sins in the world, or all evil. He becomes a personification of that, and almost as an opposite to God, like in the Manichaeanism and Zoroastrian type worldviews in the past. And in that one, I would say that it is sort of a light bringer character, but it's a bit more of a knowledge guard or guardian, or threshold guardian character, rather than in a knowledge bringer type character. And I'll get more into that later as well. Another question that comes up a lot is Luciferianism a branch of Satanism? And that's a bit of a complicated question as well, but I'll say not usually. The roots of Luciferianism come more through Theosophy and Freemasonry and Enlightenment philosophy, where it's seen in the classical sense of the term rather than as equivalent to the devil, you know. Although there are some people who call themselves Luciferian that came to it through Satanism. And so you get a lot of cross-pollination, and the lines do blur a bit here and there, especially because there's a lot of parallels and similarities between Satanic philosophy and Luciferian philosophy. But Gnosticism. I'll get back to Gnosticism, because this is one of those branches, along with Theosophy and Freemasonry. Gnosticism is a mode of thought or a way of looking at the world that lends itself very easily to Luciferianism. So if you understand a bit about Gnostic philosophy, or even if you just kind of look at some of these stories from the Judeo-Christian mythology in a certain critical viewpoint, Gnosticism naturally comes out of that. So basically what Gnosticism is, it's a Greek word that means knowledge. And so a Gnostic, lowercase Gnostic, is simply somebody who seeks after gnosis, or knowledge, experiential knowledge, not just reading a book that's more just information, but actually knowing something through direct experience. And uppercase Gnosticism, uppercase G Gnosticism, is more of a kind of a philosophy. And it's a way of looking at things. It's pre-Christian, but it really kind of took hold when the Christian religion was being formed. And the best way to describe it is through the creation myths. So a basic retelling of the Adam and Eve story from a Gnostic perspective would be that essentially you have this creator God that has its own backstory. So he was actually created as an accident, and he's blind and ambitious and doesn't see anything but himself and thinks of himself as the highest God, but he's deluded. And he decides to create, and that's the physical plane. That's what the physical plane ends up being. And he creates all these creatures, including humans, and gives them life and gives them the environment in order to kind of have people that he has control over. And he makes humans ignorant in order to be better slaves. And they tend his garden, keep the animals, and things like that. And he sets them in this garden, and there's this tree of knowledge. And he tells them, don't eat from the tree of knowledge, or you'll die, because that's the best way to scare them from actually going ahead and trying it. But the serpent comes in, and there's a backstory for the serpent as well, where the serpent is actually an entity created through the reflection of God Most High into the physical plane. So it's almost like a spark of the divine has kind of copied itself into the physical plane, and that is what the serpent is. It's like the incarnation of God Most High beyond all of the deluded, power-hungry, jealous gods, and acting in this physical plane. And the serpent is not even always a he, sometimes it's a she. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. The serpent convinces Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge, says, God's lying, you're not going to die. He just doesn't want you to have all the knowledge like the gods have. And because he wants you to be under his thumb, he wants you to be his servants, his slaves, and he wants you to remain ignorant. And so they eat from the tree, and they realize that he was right. And God gets really angry and boots him out. But the reason that he boots him out, and this is in the canonical version of the story, is because he's afraid that now that they have all the knowledge of the gods, that they're also going to eat from the tree of life and become immortal, and they'll be just like the gods. And so it was because they wanted to keep them down. They didn't want the humans to be able to attain divinity. They wanted them, they said, well, if they're smart, at least they're not immortal, And so we still have some kind of control over them. So in this story, God is the bad guy, and he is basically a slave owner and wants to keep people ignorant slaves. And you can see this kind of theme throughout the scriptures, calling people sheep, and needing a shepherd, and infantilizing, making people revert to their more childish kind of selves and not grow up and take their own personal responsibility. And the serpent is the liberator. He brings the knowledge that allows them to transcend this drudgery state and think for themselves, and even seek higher things as well. So Lucifer's a good guy, and he's the one that's looking out for humanity. And so that's kind of a very common Gnostic perspective. And a lot of times they just considered themselves Gnostic Christians. They didn't consider themselves Luciferians per se. They felt that they were Gnostic Christians. But this is it was a kind of a Gnostic Luciferian ideology that they held to. Some of them were pretty fanatic about it too. So, there's dangers in any kind of fanaticism where the Cathars, for example, were one sect of Gnostics who believed that literally the myth, the Gnostic retelling, literally, to the point where they felt that procreation was evil because you're just helping the demiurge or the evil god and his minions, who they call the archons, like the archangels or whatever, that work for the evil god, that it was just helping them provide another physical body to entrap another soul into this prison planet, essentially. And so they didn't have sexual intercourse that would result in procreation ever. And they only got new members through converts. And, that's pretty extreme. So you can get extremism in Gnosticism as well, especially people start taking these things literally rather than for the lessons that it's supposed to try and convey, or the truths that it's trying to kind of pass on to you. And